let's get into it. The first of our challenging questions that we're going to take a look at the science to try to answer. The first is this one. Do diverse gender experiences create more transgender children? Do diverse gender experiences create more transgender children? So this is a question that really hooks on 5 big studies in the early 80s, right? In the 80s, there were 5 big studies that looked at diverse gender experiences, people who were sort of gender non-conforming, and asked the question, if these young people are engaging in the world in unusual ways in terms of gender, is it going to confuse them further, in inverted commas? God, my fingers are just getting tired from the air quoting. Are we going to make more transgender people by allowing people to experiment in the world like that? Complicated question. And the first place we need to sort of round on is this. It's talking to a very kind of famous researcher in the field in the early 80s, a guy called Richard Green. And he said this: I'm convinced that it's a hell of a lot easier negotiating life as a gay man or a lesbian woman than as a trans woman or trans man. The vitriol over whether to enable gender dysphoric prepubertal children to gender transition engages psychosexual and general mental health issues and must be informed by data, not ideology. Families and professionals invested in the best interests of these children require strong evidence on the risks and benefits of transition, and if there is to be transition, with which children. Longitudinal studies are urgent, with comprehensive objective measures of those who transition and those who do not. This is a brave new world of gender. The young Hamlet can thrive from empiricism, not polemic. What a writer. Love his writing, Richard Green. Insofar as it is a little bit, maybe a little bit gender critical, but, is a scientist. He's permitted to have a view on these subjects. Basically, sort of boiling down Richard Green's question here, we have this. Children who socially transition could differ from those who do not even before transitioning. Or, this is kind of his view, his question, says children who socially transition could be different from those who do not, even before they transition, or transitioning could make them more trans. Now, when we talk about transition here, we're talking about children. The only transition available to children is social. There are no pubertal, no hormonal, no medical transition services available. They don't need them. Their bodies don't differentiate until they hit puberty. So children, all they need really is social transition. If they experience themselves to be strongly female in the world, and they might need to engage in the world as a girl to be related to as one in order to feel okay. Richard Green's point is, do those children who engage in transition in that way therefore become more female? Or do the children who transition start more female and that's why they transition? Big question. We turn to one of my all-time favorites. If I ever meet Celine Gulgos in real life, I am going to pass out and I need you to save me. Literally, I'm not joking. I will fall unconscious. She's absolutely awesome. Her and Christine Olsen, fantastic researchers doing some really important work in this field, and this is one of them. They basically take a look at children who later live as girls in the world, right? And they take a look at those who transition early and those who don't transition until a little later, and they compare them. And this is what they find. Celine Gulgos and the research team find this. Someone who is assigned male at birth, who will later transition to live as a girl, is roughly as feminine before transition as a transgender girl is after transition. Someone who will later transition to live as a girl is as feminine as before transition as transgender girls are after transition. Both are comparable in degree of feminine identity and preferences to a non-transgender girl. So trying to put this into words that are easier to understand, we take three groups, right? We take three groups. Trans kids who don't socially transition until a little later, trans kids who socially transition a bit younger, and non-trans kids of the same assigned gender as the identity of the trans kids. So trans girls who are assigned male at birth, who later transition to be girls in the world, trans girls assigned male at birth who transition early, and non-transgender girls. And they compare the three, and they basically find that the act of transition early does not make children more transgender. It doesn't make these girls more feminine. They were more feminine to begin with, and that's why they socially transitioned. Furthermore, our results showed that children who transitioned showed more extreme cross-sex identification and preferences before transitioning. In contrast, we found evidence that children tested after transitioning did not differ meaningfully from those tested before transitioning in terms of identification and preferences. Our children who transitioned early do not differ significantly from those who transition a little later. The act of transition seems not to shape gender identity. And here they've got their graph, beautiful, their transgender boys and girls and their control boys and girls on how they explicitly identify, on their implicit associations. Now, implicit association tests can't really be fooled by, expectancy bias, for example. So this is the implicit associations. Their similarities to other children of the same gender, toy preferences, clothing preferences, their peer groups, all, you can see there are very similar patterns between the transgender children and the non-transgender children of the same gender identities. So children who are assigned male at birth, who identify as girls, are very similar to people assigned female at birth who identify as girls. Important stuff. Gould goes on to conduct another piece of research, which I really like here. This is, again, kind of very similar, but using a very kind of modern model of gender. And you can see it here. They used a kind of a very simple, we don't think this is a very sophisticated model, but maybe simple is good when we're talking about children to begin with. We'll get to more sophisticated models with time. They ask this: some people feel they're a boy, some people feel they're a girl, and some people feel they're somewhere in between a boy and a girl. On the line below, put an X in the place you think best shows how you feel on the inside. So you have boy on one end, girl on the other, and it's a kind of linear spectrum between the two. So they ask children to kind of identify themselves on that list. Now, if we take a look here, this is essentially what they found. Among transgender participants, they examined the extent to which time since transition predicted participants' responses on the spectrum measure, right? So now we're not just looking at how people sort of consciously identify. We're not just looking at people's interests or their implicit associations or their clothing choices or their peer choices. Now we're looking at their actual gender as they rate it on a scale between masculine and feminine, male and female. They write on the scale between boy and girl, rather. And they find out, does transition change how people rate themselves on there, right? Now, they control for age, essentially, because time since transition is correlated with participant age, understandably. And they found that participants' gender identities, as measured on the spectrum, did not differ by how long they had lived as their current gender, right? Children who were more extreme in their cross-sex identification transition, but the age of their transition, the duration of their transition, how long they have transitioned for socially, does not change how they identify. So this is the strongest evidence we've got so far. The strongest evidence we've got so far that how people identify is not shaped by the act of social transition. Instead, it informs the act of social transition, right? And that's really, really important because it answers the question that Green posed and it answers our overarching question. Does the act of engaging in the world in exploratory ways change how children identify in terms of gender, in terms of preferences, in terms of does exploring the world as a girl make children more female? Does exploring the world, engaging the world, expressing themselves as more masculine, does that make them more male? Is gender identity here, in these cases, born or made? And this is the strongest evidence. Only the last couple of years that this has been produced. This is the strongest evidence that I have come across to answer that question. The answer to that question is, as far as I can tell, in my genuine reading of this literature, gender identity, at least for these participants, is born and not made. More cross-sex identification, stronger cross-sex identification invites and informs transition. Transition does not inform cross-sex identification. When we come back, we tackle the next of our questions. Oh, spicy times. Look forward to seeing you in the next one.